Hello, everyone.
Hello, how are you?
Doing great. How about you?
Good, thanks. Good. We will wait a few minutes and I'll let some additional people join, and then we will get started.
Not in the office today, Brett. Oh.
All right. All right. I will just go ahead and get started. Great. So today we are going to be talking about user configured dimensions.
I got very mildly sick, and my wife never got sick.
Hold on 1 second.
And we didn't isolate or anything. So.
If you wouldn't mind muting yourself.
It's only a matter of time, Frank.
Cool, thank you. All right, there we go. All right, user configured dimensions. So what does this translate to? It translates to tags, labels for containers, account groups, and business dimensions. We did end up moving the views to a separate day just because there's a lot more complexity in that. We thought it would be better. Great, so I'm going to start simple, just so we're all on the same page, and then get into kind of the nuts and bolts per se. So what are tags? Tags are just truly imported from the billing export files. So AWS, GCP, and Azure, when you spin up a resource in the cloud, you have an option to add a tag or label to that specific resource. So it's a metadata tag that identifies it in terms of some certain dimension. So think about if I spin up a resource like a machine, EC2 instance in the cloud, I'm going to go ahead and attach a tag to that says like a cost center, meaning I now know who to charge it back to. Within Cloudability, we map those in tag dimensions. So let's take a quick look at that. So within organized tags and labels, we can actually map these individually or multiple to one. And we're gonna continue to get more into the details here. So account groups, what are those? Those are metadata tags that are stored solely in Cloudability. This is not part of the billing files. These are 100% stored in Cloudability. They are in account dimensions, and you can attach a label to the account level. So what this translates to is GCP accounts are projects. With Azure, the accounts translate to subscriptions, and with AWS, they're linked accounts. So several different flavors. They all basically represent the same tiering, and we'll see how to attach those. Lastly, what are business dimensions? Business dimensions are the ability to add advanced logic inside of Cloudability, and we'll see an example of that today. Why use these dimensions? It's still all about identification and tracking. We use it for cost allocation, so you always want to allocate costs to an appropriate cost center or application, and ultimately budgeting. Right, you want to forecast out costs. See how you're tracking towards your ultimate bottom line. Great. So let's get into tag more. Let's kind of double click on the tags first. We've already covered their part of the billing files. For GCP, okay, so for GCP, we also will use project level tags. So there's a hierarchy within GCP, there's a resource, and then every resource is stored within a project. So these tags, we will bring in via the project level or the resource level, but everything in Cloudability, it will take the resource level tag first. If there's nothing there, no tag set, it will then default to the project level tag. If there's no project level tag, then it just return value is not set. Azure, similarly, if you are advanced credentialed, every resource in Azure belongs to Azure resource group. So this is just a logical grouping of resources. So you can tag at either level. Again, if you have both set, sorry, if you are using the resource level, it's going to use that first. If you're using a multiple of these, you do partial on the resources and partial at the resource group, it's going to take the resource value first, and then it will take the resource group tag only if the resource level is blank. Now, I do want to say for both GCP and Azure, this is a great feature. We cannot configure though, and we don't have the ability to see where that tag is coming from. So you might pull a resource report in Cloudability. You can't really identify whether that tag is coming from the resource or resource group. It's all handled by the pipeline behind the scenes. So just, in terms of troubleshooting, that is one thing you can run into. There is a product feature request though to break those out so that customers can then basically choose whether a tag comes from resource or resource group. So just want to flag that as a differentiator there. In AWS though, there are account level tags and organizational level tags. We don't support those today. So meaning the only tags that we get from the vendor for AWS is at the resource itself. So no tiering with AWS. And then lastly, containers. It's a similar concept. So instead of it being called a tag though, it's called a label. So that's just a container nomenclature. But same concept. And we'll see that here in a second, Cloudability. All right, so best practices around tagging. Let's cover this, and then we'll look at the products. First, use names when you're defining them to be more verbose, meaning be more specific. You're not going to run out of words. You can have things that are longer. It's always preferential to be more specific. Map all variations to a tag. So this can be, tags are also, unless you're using a provisioning service, tags are free form. So, I can put env, I can misspell environment, or I can actually use it correctly in terms of environment. What we can do in Cloudability though is basically use these together, and we'll get into how that's used in Cloudability. And then there's vendor specific tags that come through. So AWS created by, that's one example. Azure Resource Group. These are default tags that come through, whether customer wants to or not. But via tag mapping, we can either bring them in or not. And then when you do have container labels, map those to existing dimensions when possible, but you can choose not to. So let's take a look at how this translates. You can have a one-to-one mapping, right? So this is, the AWS created by on line 3 here. And we can see we labeled it created by. We were very, very, creative here. If we come down to product code though, now we see that there are multiple tag keys mapped to one Cloudability dimension. And the way Cloudability works is that it's a very logical ordering process. So if AWS created by has a value in it, it will use this and it's going to ignore the next two. Likewise, if AWS created by is blank or not set, it's going to use the value in connect, and so on and so forth. So this ordering is very crucial. So if you have a preferred tag key, you always want to put that first. You know, in the back of the example where there's multiple, you know, like there's environment, right? That's going to be the correct one. And then env might be the second one, and then you know, the misspelled environment would be the third. So we'd want to layer those appropriately. Now, if you have a customer that says, well, you know, I want to be able to see the value of connect, and I also want to see the value of created by. Well, you need to break those up. You need to create, like we have here, dimension 1 and then dimension 3. We've broken those out. So we want to make sure, depending on the use case, you know, appropriately handling tags. Now, if we come down to dimension 10, you know, we can see that there are the blue and the green. The blue are the cost tags. The green are the labels from the containers. So that's how you know the difference. And they're broken out too. So you have the top portion up here, and then you got the bottom portion. So that's how they're represented. I think the only last other note is sometimes you will need to break out the labels based on the use case. So in that case, you just create a new dimension. A couple notes on this too, though. You know, tags and labels are only available from when they are provisioned. So if a customer today spends up, you know, hey, I'm going to add a new tag to my AWS invoice. Well, that tag is only available from May 12th moving forward. We can't say go back to May 1st. Likewise, you know, containers, same thing. So, you know, we have containers agent and labels. We can always collect those from when they're deployed and moving forward. So, you know, it's important that when we onboard customers, we try to get these as many labels and tags into Cloudability as soon as possible. That way we have more historical, but it can be tricky if they want to go back in time. All right, let's just taking a look at the chat real quick. Alex, what is your question?
It was just something I actually looked into recently because it confused me, that little toggle switch in the tagging screen. Like I wasn't sure what that meant because it almost makes it seem like automatically map tags. So it sounds like there's like, oh, we're gonna pull tags in and then automatically, intelligently, you know, map them to these dimensions, but it doesn't. All it's saying is we're gonna pull these from the cur so that they're available to map.
Correct.
Yeah, it was just something I thought might have, you know, misled someone else. So I want to point that out.
Good.
I had a customer ask, what is there a situation where you would turn that off? I didn't know how to answer it. I said, or I think somebody else said no.
It's think of it as if they really want to freeze it, they can. But to the point, they still have to map it. So there really is no purpose to turn it off. I've never ran into one, at least.
Hey Kyle, quick question. Think about if a customer is migrating to a new tag, like, hey, we used to use this tag and now we want to use this new one, and we're going to start provisioning instances with this new tag. We can't like version this mapping. So is there some specific way we should think about that kind of, you know, helping them migrate to a new tagging strategy?
It depends on how, I mean, it depends on the use case, but it's a good question. You're correct. There is no versioning to this page. That said, we can map additional dimensions. And actually in the tag key itself, we should be able to see the tag key value, so we can actually date provision in the business mapping. So if we can say business mapping, you know, if created by one second, I'm not sure where there we go. What really, if they are insistent and say we absolutely need that historical, you will need to break it out into 2 different dimensions, and then use a business mapping of sorts to say, before this date, you know, you're going to use this tag dimension. After this date, you're going to use this other dimension. But most times, what I end up doing is just reordering instead of, you know, if they're using a new tag moving forward. Typically, we're not going to reprocess historical. Now, we may, you know, so there's the big asterisk there. And I don't want to get the details, but it can screw up historical if you do reorder. But, you know, most customers are okay with just changing the order in tag dimensions. And Ilya brought up the tag name tag within AWS. I think it's this one right here.
Yes, this one exactly.
Yeah, it will give you resource name if they've enabled it, right, Ilya?
Yeah, it's out of a box tag which AWS will populate. So if you enable this for billing, you will get resource name.
Yeah, great point out. Thank you. All right. Okay, so let's look at account groups. It's a one-to-one. Once we get into it, you'll understand this a little bit more, but there is a one-to-one relationship between account and a value. So you can't have multiple values, and we'll see that in a second. Only use one account group when at least some account level organization is used. So, you know, it's a use case. I have some customers who use it and others don't. So just because it's there, you know, let's not force customers to use it. This one's a big one. Avoid naming collisions with other dimensions. So think about, again, environment. Like you can set an environment at a tag. You can set an environment at an account dimension, and you can set an environment business dimension. So, you know, best practices is, you know, like it shows here, is either adding a prefix, so account environment, you know, business mapping environment. I've used final environment at times, but just be very aware. Otherwise, you know, end users will get confused. You know, as we move to BI, what's nice is we can actually disable what fields come into the BI and only include the final one if we're using multiple logics. And then, yeah, there's an edit button that we'll see here, which is edit multiple. Okay, so let's take a look. So account groups, when you click on this account groups, you can actually label each group name. So this is the account dimension name. So essentially the key. If I look at a specific account, which is under here, now this is the value that I then put into essentially the account mapping. So this can be used in multiple ways. You know, if they want to rename the accounts to be more pedestrian, you know, there's a lot of good use cases here. But again, I just want to point out there is a one-to-one relationship. So I can't enter in, you know, foo, comma, foo2, and you know, this is how it's going to show up. It's going to be a one-to-one name to account. And then you can see, so each one of these I mentioned earlier, Google, these are projects, Amazon, these are linked accounts, and then Azure, these are subscriptions. So just be aware of when you're talking to a customer. You know, they might say, well, I want to label my subscription. Great, we can do that. But it just happens to be account in Cloudability.
So I think, Kyle, I just want to like double down on something you mentioned. This is only relevant if the customer can articulate to you an organizational strategy around these accounts. So like for our team, the discovery question is, you know, how do you organize your accounts? Are some of these like dev accounts, some of these prod? Do some of these accounts map to specific products? And if the answer is no to all of those, you can effectively say, okay, well, we won't use this feature now. And if you rearrange your accounts into that way, we can use this feature. Does that
That's
make
exactly
sense?
right, Dan. Yeah.
Great. And there are use cases to double click on that too, is a great point out. Some customers will use a multi-tier logic based on their use case. So like projects, for instance, within Google, you know, a lot of the customers I end up working with, it may be true across the board, but each project is more of like, oh, this is a production workload. Whereas Azure, you know, Azure might be treated differently. So you might have a subscription which covers, you know, multiple resource groups, multiple workloads, multiple. So you might end up having multi-tiered, like you might use this for GCP only and not for Azure. So good call out there. All right, business dimensions. I love business dimensions because it's so flexible. I also dislike them because it can become very complex very quickly. And there's so many layers to this, but let's just kind of go over the kind of 201 type logic. So a couple of use cases here. Jeff, actually, do you want to read through these?
Sure.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So, you know, one very common use case we see, you know, like Kyle was saying, they might have multiple different layers of organization. And so if they have tags that kind of supersede their account organization, then we can set it up so that we use account groups first if those exist. And then if they don't exist, or rather we use tags first if those exist. And if they don't exist, then we can fall back to an account group. And so combining tags and account groups is something we see a lot in that way. We might also, you know, let's say we have a cost center that always contains shared costs. And, you know, we can use a business mapping to kind of single out those shared costs and apply the correct cost center to those shared costs. Another really good example that's easy to implement is tag compliance. So I actually wrote a community post on this, but basically you set up in the logic, well, what is required for our tagging compliance? You know, which tags are required? Are there any formatting things that need to be considered? You know, are there invalid tags that we might want to call out? You know, things like that. And we can build all of those into the logic of a business mapping. That way, very quickly, you know, someone can log in and have a tagging compliance dashboard and have an idea of like, well, how much of my spend is compliant versus not. And of course, there are way more use cases than that. Those are just, you know, some of the most common. Another easy one is like, you know, just using them instead of a business of an account group. So if you have thousands of accounts, you know, you can often update a business mapping much more easily because you only have to upload it once for a business mapping, right? You set your JSON, you upload it once, and it's done, right? So that's via the API. Whereas with account groups, you have to do each account individually, and every one is its own API call. So that can get quite cumbersome and take a long time. And that's actually what the UI is doing with Edit Multiple too. So there aren't any shortcuts at the moment.
Cool. So I want to take one quick step back, and then we'll get into business mappings in a second here. What I do want to point out, yesterday we talked about, kind of gotchas, right? So Dan, you brought up, what if they change their tagging strategy, right? What if they, change the logic? Where's the kind of gotchas in these is, it really has to do with around the processing. So, each one of these, some of these tags are coming in from bills, others are stored within Cloudability, business mappings are stored in here, account groups are stored in here. So if you change one and then you reprocess, say, the entire history of the customer, it will literally change the entire history all the way back. So if if they had a change in tagging order, or if they relabeled their account groups, what's going to happen is, those values will change. So it's something to just be aware of. We can never say with absolute certainty that we won't at some point reprocess historical data as well. When we moved to a new kind of back end, we actually had to basically re-index all of every customer. I think this happened about 2.5 or 3 years ago. So, customers who were using historical, their historical data changed. So that's kind of a gotcha we'll throw out there. The other thing is, we talked about it yesterday, the reprocess. If a customer does change something in here, try to use your reprocess, to test. So maybe, reprocess just current month if they change things, and then, come back once it works, instead of having to, reprocess all of history and wait several hours and then come back. It's just kind of best practices in there. Okay, so I do want to give a quick example of kind of how the business mappings can work. So one use case is kind of around normalization of multiple values. So in here, I've got a project value. So this is a tag. And you can see, first of all, there's several different values for this particular tag. I have an account mapping. So this was an account dimension. And we have several different values for that as well. So what is this first all project normalization tag doing? The first thing it does is it goes top down. Okay, so if it matches a certain criteria, that is what the value is for this project dimension. So in this case, I am saying if this account mapping that that we've put in there equals magic or only magic all the time, I actually want the value to be Taz_Canary. So I'm changing the value basically of these. I'm not changing the value of the count group, but I'm changing the value of the dimension itself. Then if I'm not meeting, if these aren't met, then the secondary step is I'm now going to look at the project tag. So now I'm in one business mapping, I first start with an account dimension. If that logic isn't sound enough, then I move on to my project tag. And here I'm just saying if the project is not equal to not set. So it's essentially saying if the project has a value, then go ahead and use my project tag. You can see this is a blue, so this is a dynamic. So if I click on it, you'll notice that there's a drop down. And so I can actually enter in, if the condition below is true, then use this value. I'm not sure where the project went. So great. So then what I wanted to also point out is you can actually layer multiple business dimensions on each other. So here I have project normalization. So I've normalized based on certain criteria, but now I want to say project final. And so now in here, you can actually see what I'm doing is I'm actually using the project normalization business mapping. And I'm saying if this business mapping contains a certain value, so in this Taz, then I want to use that project normalization business mapping. So what I'm doing is I'm tiering. I just want to demonstrate real quick that you can actually use business mappings to reference account dimensions, reference tags, and other business mappings. And the business mapping is smart enough to figure out what logical order it needs to go in. So I'll just give a
Hey,
quick.
Kyle, what about circular references? Like, is there potential for that?
I have not figured out how to do that yet. Actually,
I think it will call that out actually. Like if there's
Was
a
it?
circular reference, it might, yeah.
okay.
I would want to double check, but I think that's the case.
Oh, good to know. Thanks. Cool. So I just want to walk through real quick, like all that logic. This is fairly simple. But here we have the project. This the tag. This is the actual account mapping. And actually, I should probably reorder this in terms of the order. There we go. So now we have. You see, this is not set. So then it comes to the next logic, which is the project tag. So I get a project normalization value, and the project final is now based on this project normalization value. So you can see it might start at magic, but because my logic is requesting something else, then I get different values. So we can get way more complex. I think Jeff is actually going to hold another session on purely business mappings in logic. So we just to kind of give a flavor, you can do things like and, if, or you can combine statements together, and you can use regex. So pretty much infinite possibilities within here.
Yeah, once you get into the API, rather than the UI, we get access to a couple more functions that are very, very useful. Kyle, I was curious if there was any reason you used not equals not set instead of exists.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Like Studio, those of you who use Studio, there are multiple ways to reference values in Cloudability. So if we come back in, I think it was
that one.
This one, yeah. So I intentionally did label it this way, where it says project not equal not set. This will work. However, to Jeff's point, we can actually just say if the project tag exists. Those two will actually get the net same outcome. I believe there's a comment in, yes. Steve, you brought up case sensitivity. So Jeff, you want to talk about case sensitivity in terms of tags and values?
Sure. So these are not case sensitive, right? So any value that comes into Cloudability is always going to be lowercase. We are going to ensure that it's not case sensitive in that way. And so when we make a business mapping, we don't have to worry about case sensitivity as far as like the logic goes. I think that we implemented an uppercase function for business mappings, but that's only for like displaying it at the end and like, making this like look a little bit prettier. As far as the logic goes, it is completely case insensitive.
And do you make a comment about kind of the gotchas of tag? Sorry, tag keys and spaces and hidden characters.
Yeah, so I've run into this a couple of times. If when they set up their tags, there's like a leading space or like an empty space at the end, then that can, that will carry over into Cloudability and it can cause some confusion. So because that space at the end is going to be invisible here in the drop-down box. And in fact, I've run into a case where, they had a tag, they had one version with no space at the end, and they had a version with a space at the end. And, at some point we remove that space, just because it's standard practice to remove the space. And then in the dropdown box, there's only one version. And I mean, even if there were two, you couldn't tell them apart. So to fix that, I had to assign the tag in the UI and the API rather. And it was a big mess, to say the least. But that's just something to be aware of. Like, if you aren't getting the values that they expect, and you're trying to do some troubleshooting, then that might be something that you consider. Is like, well, is this really the tag key that we would want? Is it possible that there are multiple, and that sort of thing? It's rare, I would say, but it has come up for me a couple times.
And when do tags show up in this dropdown?
I mean, they'll show up as soon as we see them in the billing export files or in the resource groups, I believe. So like as soon as we get a billing export file that has a tag key, it should show up in this dropdown file, the dropdown list. Now that also means that the dropdown list can get quite large, right? Because it's going to show you every tag that we've ever seen. But that's really the only way to do it. You talked about the vendor specific tags, right?
Good.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. When do accounts in here show up?
I think it's the same thing. I think where they will show up when they show up in the billing export file. It's a little strange because like you might think like, well, if I make a new project in GCP and I like refresh the verification, isn't that going to go check with my project lists? Like, well, no, actually, we have to get a billing file from the vendor to be able to know which accounts are actually active. And so we're not going to pull in every single project if a project doesn't have any usage and nor any cost, then it's not going to show up.
And I think that's a great gotcha, by the way, because some customers will want say they do have a strategy at the account level, right? And some customers will say, well, as soon as I add it to AWS or to Azure or GCP, they might create a group, right? Whether it's a project or whether it's a subscription. But if there's no costs underneath that, like resources spun up, it's not going to show up in this list. And therefore, they can't actually create that mapping in Cloudability. So, it's a chicken or the egg thing, right? But we do have to wait for it to show in Cloudability before we can create the logic around it. Where there's one exception though is, and this is an advantage to business mapping. You can create logic ahead of time. So if you have a customer who knows, say, all the projects that eventually will be in Cloudability, say they're doing a migration strategy, you can actually build a business mapping in the future. So say you have a project or say you have an account, you're gonna, it's gonna be Kyle's account. I can actually come to the business mapping, say, Kyle's account will be this cost center in a business mapping. It doesn't have to show up, but the account dimensions it does, as well as the tags. There has to be cost around it. Jeff did post in the chat. I'm just going to flash it up real quick. The community. Oh, I need to log in. So 1 minute. But any questions?
Yeah, Kyle, just a clarification. I know Jeff mentioned, hey, if you get tags that have spaces in it, sometimes you have to go and programmatically sort of address that, maybe set different tags using the API. Is that the same case that for what Steve called out, like if they have a prod capitalized and the underscore prod that come in, it's all going to lowercase it. So like, what if there's conflicting values? Like, what is it? Does it show you the value for
Yeah, great
the
question.
capital?
Can you pull up one of the dimensions here, Kyle? I wonder if we have an example. Let's see. So usually, as I understand it, if there's something that was capitalized, we're still going to undercase it, but we're going to put an underscore after that letter. I don't see any examples here, but like, you know, you'll see it often, like with environment, there'll be E underscore V underscore N, or ENV, sorry. And that happens, you know, quite frequently, right? Because, you know, maybe they'll have some tagging convention, and that's the way that we avoid collisions in that case. So the keys, yeah, that's the one way that we make the keys pseudo case sensitive.
Thanks, that'll help clear it up if I ever see that.
Yep. So we had a question in the chat about negating the group for business mappings. And what that does is it takes, you know, the logic and says, well, instead of wanting to know if this group is true, I want to know if this group is false. And if it's false, then I'll actually consider it to be true. I don't know if we can pull up one of those examples, Kyle. Yeah, the canary one actually is not a terrible example, right? So if either of these things is true, well, right now we would use that Tay's canary value. But if we were to negate the group, then what that does is it flips the logic. So basically it changes all of those equals, you know, and well, that's not, I don't want to say that that's how it works because it's not how it works. But it takes that group and it says, well, if this group is true, instead it's false. And if the group is false, well, now it's true. And so in this particular case, if the owning division, you know, dimension is either magic or, you know, only magic all the time, then the value will not be applied to canary, and everything else that doesn't have those values will get that canary value. I know it's a little confusing sometimes, but there are some particular cases where it can make like a lot of sense to you know, use that kind of logic, and it's just a lot easier to negate the group rather than trying to move things around and construct them in a way that that you get the value you want.
Did that answer the question? So I'm going to assume silence is yes. So. All right.
Any other questions?
Great. Well, thanks all for joining. We will see you next time. And if there's any questions, as always, please reach out to, you know, Tam, you know, Jeff, myself, to help answer any additional questions.
Sure. Have a good one.
Bye.